Thank you, Director Peters, and I'll begin. Director Peters, you were appointed over the summer. You've been on the job about 5 months, correct?
That's correct.
So I think it's important to acknowledge, and I know Ranking Member Johnson and I think both acknowledge you are new in this post. The overwhelming majority, if not all, of the events presented in our report occurred prior to your tenure. Nevertheless, as you and I discussed in your confirmation, or your first hearing rather, in the Judiciary Committee, the buck now stops with you. And one thing I want to just state at the outset of your responses to our questions today is that while we are deeply interested in your plans for reform, and you'll have every opportunity to present them, the purpose of this hearing as well is to examine what happened in the past, what went wrong, and what's been broken at the Bureau of Prisons. And you, in your capacity leading the BOP today, are here to help us understand that. So I hope that's clear, Director Peters.
Very clear, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And same to you, Mr. Horowitz.
Yes. Yes.
So Ranking Member Johnson made reference to this in his questions to our prior panel, defining the scope of the problem. We agree that's vital. What we found in the course of this investigation is that in 2/3 of the federal prisons that have housed women in the last 10 years, there has been sexual abuse of female prisoners by BOP employees. And I believe this number is likely significantly higher, both in the number of facilities and the number of cases, in part because of the severe deficiencies we've identified in terms of how, Director Peters, the Office of Internal Affairs handles investigations of allegations of sexual abuse, the limitations that you've acknowledged, Inspector General Horowitz, in your office, as well as the widespread fear of retaliation and a culture of impunity that we've seen prevail in multiple of these cases. I mean, we start with Dublin. It was widely known before much broke into the official record that there was a serious problem at Dublin. There have been multiple convictions. There are over a dozen ongoing criminal investigations. This went on for years. And the warden and the chaplain were sexually abusing prisoners. Before Dublin, multiple officers abusing multiple female inmates at other facilities, MCC New York, MDC Brooklyn, FCC Coleman. Every few years, despite the culture of impunity, despite the fear of retaliation, it has broken in to the public consciousness that there's a serious problem, and yet nothing systemic has been done to address it. And in fact, when we asked senior BOP personnel what was done after the Brooklyn facts came to light, what was done after the Coleman facts came to light, little or nothing in the way of a systemic attempt to address the issue. So I want to understand from you, Director Peters, why? I mean, you've been in the job now for 5 months. Presumably you have debriefed senior leadership that's outgoing, yes?
Yes, Senator.
You've inspected prisons.
Yes.
You've discussed these issues with regional directors, with wardens. You've, I presume, done your best to understand this so that you can be effective at addressing it. Before we get into what you're going to change, why is it that for 10 years, despite it being known to BOP leadership there was a serious problem, nothing was done to address it in any kind of systemic or effective way?
Senator, I wish I had a good answer to that question. What I can tell you is that when you look at the institutions that you're highlighting, the Brooklyn, MCC New York, Dublin, and you see an institution that has been riveted with cases. It's hard to explain. It's hard to understand how systemic changes were not implemented. When you look at the power differential inside an institution, there is no ability for an individual who is carcerated to consent to any form of sexual relations. And then when you look at individuals like a warden and like a chaplain, There's something even more exponential there in terms of that power differential. And so I find that that situation is absolutely egregious, and it is about the systemic change. That's what we need to look at, Senator. We need to be able to look in all of the categories that I mentioned in my opening statement. We have to figure out how to prevent this. We have to figure out how to better investigate, streamline resources, hold people accountable, and work to prosecute those who deserve prosecution.
Thank you, Director Peters. I appreciate that. And again, I want to stipulate, I think it's important for the public to be reminded that the events that we're investigating have predated your tenure. Nevertheless, I think you have to understand why systemic change was neither attempted nor succeeded. Because for you to reform this vast bureaucracy, which is diseased, and this subcommittee has done other work looking at the BOP in the last few months. We looked at corruption and misconduct in Atlanta, for example, and we examined in the course of that hearing a lack of accountability from the very top. You need to understand that in order to change it. Here's something I want to just put to you and get your response, Director Peters. We in the course of conducting this investigation, heard different things from folks at different levels of your organization. So, for example, we interviewed a former warden at Dublin, not the one who's been convicted, but a former warden at Dublin, who described this as, and this is a quote from his interview, bad people making bad choices. He identified it as, and I'm now paraphrasing, but the gist of it was a few bad apples, people making the wrong choices, not so much systemic. He denied there was a culture of abuse. But we spoke with your Chief of Internal Affairs, who described a culture of abuse, who described it as systemic at that facility. I mean, have you, for example, talked to the regional director who was in charge at the time to understand how it could have evaded their attention that this was ongoing at Dublin for so long? And how is it that there are these different views within your own bureaucracy? You got a former warden saying just a few bad apples, and your own internal affairs folks saying it was a culture of abuse.
Thank you, Senator. I have a tough time understanding how the warden drew that conclusion based on the facts as I observed them today. I have not spoken to that warden. I have had lengthy conversations with the administrator responsible for our office internal affairs, and we agree. That is a culture of abuse. That is a culture of misconduct, and that culture needs to be reset in order to ensure the safety and security of those in our care and custody. And I think we do have systemic changes in the works that will help us reset that culture there and throughout the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Thank you. Ranking Member Johnson.